When Tom Ellis saw Emma at that community market, pregnant and struggling to stay on her feet, he knew his past filled with lies and selfishness wouldn't be easy to leave behind. But could a millionaire, used to winning at everything, repair the damage he had caused to a heart he had broken? Tom Ellis had everything many would call success. Renowned as one of the most promising architects in the city, his creations graced the covers of prestigious magazines. With every award he won, the world seemed smaller compared to his ego. But at home, where money and accolades couldn't reach, Tom faced an abyss: his inability to be present for Emma, his wife. Every new project was an excuse to avoid hearing her complaints or seeing her loneliness. Emma, on the other hand, lived in a state of invisibility within that marriage. She loved Tom with an intensity that hurt, but that same pain kept her trapped in a cold, one-sided routine. She made sure their home was always in order while he delved deeper into his ambitions. Emma's smile, once frequent, had become rare, and her words had lost their warmth. To Tom, everything seemed comfortable. To Emma, it was a labyrinth with no exit. The breaking point wasn't as dramatic as in the movies. It was like a sandcastle slowly washed away by the tide. An argument, more intense than usual, erupted when Tom canceled a trip planned for her birthday. Emma no longer had the strength to hear his excuses. Her request for a divorce was cold and direct, and before Tom could react, Emma was already packing her bags. He was left behind, stunned, unable to understand how it had come to this. The following months were confusing for Tom. His professional life remained flawless, but something was missing. The glass walls of his office, which reflected his image of success, started to bother him. For the first time, he wondered if being admired by strangers was enough to fill the void Emma had left. But his pride stopped him from reaching out. After all, it was she who had chosen to leave. Emma, meanwhile, found refuge in a small town far from the frenetic pace and Tom's shadow. Her life wasn't easy, every day was a battle to start over. But Emma had something Tom never understood: the ability to flourish amidst chaos. Between new jobs, friendly neighbors, and the sound of trees swaying in the wind, Emma began to rebuild herself. And with a new life growing inside her, each step felt more meaningful. Tom, no matter how much he tried, couldn't erase Emma from his mind. He buried himself in work, but every little detail, a photo on his phone, the smell of her favorite coffee, brought back memories that made him pause. Those around him noticed his distraction, but no one dared to ask. Tom believed he was moving on, when in reality he was merely running away. What Tom didn't know was that Emma held a secret that would change everything: the baby. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because, for her, it was a new chance at life. Far from Tom's expectations and frustrations, she had learned to trust only herself and the tiny being growing inside her. There were hard nights, of course, but Emma knew she had weathered far worse storms. As Tom carried on with meetings and events, an unease began to grow inside him. Something felt out of place. He could ignore the emotional chaos, but he couldn't escape the feeling that his perfect world seemed empty. And in his loneliest moments, his mind always wandered back to Emma. He wondered how she was, what she was doing. Was she happy? Did she miss him? And then, as life often does when it wants to teach a lesson, fate intervened. A community market on a random morning. Tom, looking for something trivial like coffee or bread, turned down a narrow aisle. And there she was. Emma. But not as he remembered her. She was different, stronger, yet more vulnerable. Pregnant, exhausted, but with a determination in her eyes he couldn't understand. It was as if the universe had called him to wake up. Tom froze when he saw Emma at that community market. For a moment, he thought it was an illusion created by his restless mind. But it wasn't. She was really there, standing in front of a shelf of fruit. What shook him most wasn't her presence, but the detail he hadn't expected: her rounded belly. Emma was pregnant, and there was no denying the paternity. In that instant, Tom's world, built on awards and success, crumbled before his eyes. Emma saw him out of the corner of her eye and hesitated. A part of her wanted to flee immediately, as if his presence were an unwanted reminder of a past she was trying to leave behind. But the other part, the more resilient one, stood firm. She gripped the shopping cart tightly, lifted her chin, and continued her task, ignoring Tom's shocked gaze. This wasn't the time for explanations or to reopen old wounds. Tom couldn't take his eyes off her. Every movement Emma made seemed to carry a strength he had never noticed before. There was something in her posture, in the way she faced the world alone, that made him feel small. For the first time, he realized how much he had failed her. Memories of how he had neglected her, the promises he hadn't kept, came rushing back like a punch to the gut. And now, she was pregnant, facing it all without him. He took a few steps toward her, but stopped. What could he possibly say? How could he explain months of silence, his absence during such a crucial moment? Tom wasn't good with words from the heart. His entire life had been a collection of calculated speeches, but nothing prepared him for this. The desire to redeem himself was overwhelming, but he didn't know where to begin. Emma noticed his approach and, with a cold glance, signaled she wasn't ready to talk. "Not now," was all she said before walking away. Tom stood there, rooted to the spot, his legs unable to move. The sound of her footsteps echoed in his mind. He wanted to run after her, to beg for a chance to explain, but he felt he had no right to invade the space she had clearly built without him. In the days that followed, Tom couldn't think of anything else. That unexpected encounter had turned his world upside down. He tried to bury himself in work, but every design he sketched felt incomplete. His life, once centered on achievements, now seemed meaningless. And deep down, he knew he was avoiding the one thing that truly mattered: his responsibility to Emma and the baby. The initial shock gave way to a flood of questions. Was she seeing someone else? Did she have someone helping her? And the baby? How was the baby? These unanswered questions weighed on him, transforming into guilt. He had ignored everything for so long that he didn't even know where to start fixing things. Yet, at the same time, something held him back: fear. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being irrelevant. Emma, meanwhile, tried to maintain her routine despite the emotional storm their encounter had stirred. She couldn't let Tom back into her life, not after everything. But as she unpacked her groceries in her small apartment, she realized the encounter had brought back conflicting feelings. She didn't want to admit it, but a part of her heart still reacted to the man she had once loved, even if reason told her otherwise. Tom knew he couldn't ignore how he felt. The image of Emma, pregnant and alone, was a constant reminder of his negligence. He began to understand that to regain her trust, he would need more than words. He would have to change. For the first time, Tom faced the possibility of letting go of the selfishness that had always driven his choices. But he had no idea where to start. As Emma's image lingered in his mind, Tom began to see that their meeting wasn't just a coincidence. It was a call, not only to confront the past but to transform for the future. He didn't know if Emma would ever forgive him, but for the first time, he was willing to try. Tom tried to move on, pretending the encounter with Emma hadn't affected him. He threw himself back into work, diving headfirst into ambitious projects as if drowning his emotions in blueprints and deadlines could erase them. But the image of Emma wouldn't leave him. Her pregnant silhouette, the quiet strength in her posture, and the exhaustion etched on her face replayed in his mind like an unsolvable riddle. She seemed both untouchable and hauntingly real. His pride was an impenetrable wall. He told himself there was nothing more to be done. Emma had left, and he had respected her choice. Besides, the baby was hers, not his. At least, that's what he told himself to keep the guilt at bay. Yet deep down, Tom knew the truth. The baby was his, and the thought of being absent from its life began to eat away at him. Nights became unbearable. Tom, who had always slept soundly, now woke up drenched in sweat, haunted by dreams of Emma and the baby. In those dreams, he reached out for her, but she always walked away, leaving him trapped in his own helplessness. The dreams blurred with memories of all the times he had chosen work over her, of all the promises he'd broken. He began to understand that the past couldn't simply be ignored. Still, Tom resisted. He called old friends, attended events, and filled his calendar with meetings to avoid being alone with his thoughts. But the usual distractions no longer worked. Conversations about money and achievements, which once energized him, now felt hollow. The The shimmering world of success he had built started to lose its luster. Tom was surrounded by accolades, but they couldn't fill the void Emma had left. The breaking point came one night as Tom sorted through old files in his office. Among the papers, he found a photo of Emma smiling, taken during a trip he had almost canceled for a client meeting. He remembered how she had insisted on that moment, how she had tried to pull him away from his work, and how he had spent half the trip on his phone anyway. The weight of guilt hit him like a tidal wave. He couldn't change the past, but for the first time, he began to wonder if there was still a way to fix the future. Yet the fear of failure paralyzed him. Tom had everything money could buy, but none of it had prepared him for something as raw and real as this. How could he prove to Emma that he had changed if he wasn't even sure he believed it himself? The safest option seemed to be doing nothing, avoiding the confrontation altogether. But even as he told himself this, the unease grew. Days dragged on, and the weight of his inaction grew heavier. Tom began to notice the world around him in ways he hadn't before. The laughter of children in the street, the quiet intimacy of couples in cafes, and the strange ache of knowing he wasn't part of any of it. His carefully curated life began to feel like a hollow shell. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he was deeply, undeniably alone. Then fate intervened again. While driving through the city one afternoon, Tom saw a woman pushing a stroller across the street. He slowed down, watching the scene unfold, and something shifted inside him. It wasn't Emma, but it could have been. The vision jolted him awake. He realized he couldn't keep running from this. He had spent too much of his life hiding, from his feelings, his responsibilities, and now, from Emma and the child he hadn't even met. Something needed to change. And fast. Tom sat in a downtown bar, staring at an untouched glass of whiskey. The dim lighting and quiet murmur of conversations around him provided a temporary escape from the storm in his mind. He hadn't come there to drink but to think, though his thoughts had been a chaotic mess since seeing Emma. Lost in his turmoil, he didn't notice when someone slid onto the stool next to him. "You look like hell, Ellis," came the familiar voice of Benjamin, his old college friend and mentor. "What's going on?" Tom glanced up, startled, and managed a weak smile. Benjamin was one of the few people who could speak to him without pretense. "I'm fine," Tom muttered, his voice unconvincing. Benjamin raised an eyebrow, signaling he wasn't buying it. With a sigh, Tom began to share everything: the chance encounter with Emma, the pregnancy, and the overwhelming guilt that had been haunting him. For the first time, he admitted out loud how much he had failed, not only as a husband but as a person. Benjamin listened intently, not interrupting until Tom finished. "You've always been brilliant," Benjamin said finally, leaning back in his chair. "But let's face it, you've also been selfish. Everyone saw it except you." The words hit Tom hard, but he couldn't argue. Benjamin's tone softened as he continued, "You've spent your whole life chasing trophies and applause. But tell me this, where are they now when you actually need something real?" Tom tried to defend himself, but his words faltered. Deep down, he knew Benjamin was right. He had built his life around external achievements, hiding his shortcomings behind his professional success. Benjamin didn't judge him. He understood Tom better than anyone and saw the potential for change buried beneath the layers of pride and regret. "Here's what I think," Benjamin said, leaning forward. "You've still got a chance, but it's going to take work. Hard work. You're going to have to fight, not for her, but for yourself. Because if you don't change now, you're going to carry this regret for the rest of your life." Tom felt the weight of those words settle on him like a heavy coat. They were harsh but true. He had reached a crossroads, and the path forward required humility and effort he had never been willing to give before. Benjamin shifted the conversation, sharing a story from his own life. He revealed how he had almost lost his family because of his workaholic tendencies but managed to rebuild their trust through consistent actions and patience. "It wasn't easy," Benjamin admitted. "It's humiliating, honestly. You'll have to swallow your pride and face truths you'd rather avoid. But it's worth it. Every single effort." Over the next few days, Benjamin's words echoed in Tom's mind. He replayed the conversation repeatedly, finding new layers of meaning each time. Benjamin hadn't offered a quick fix or empty platitudes. Instead, he had given Tom a roadmap, one that required him to step out of his comfort zone and confront the man he had become. Slowly, Tom began to see that the first step wasn't about Emma or the baby, it was about himself. Tom started to consider how he could begin this process. The idea of proving himself to Emma felt daunting, but Benjamin's advice gave him a new perspective. It wasn't about grand gestures or instant results. It was about showing up, consistently and genuinely, no matter how long it took. Tom knew the journey would be uncomfortable, but he also knew it was necessary. Armed with this newfound determination, Tom decided it was time to act. He wasn't sure where the road would lead, but he was ready to take the first step. Even if it meant risking rejection, he understood that the effort itself was part of his transformation. This wasn't just about fixing the past, it was about building a future he could be proud of. Tom gripped the steering wheel tightly as he parked outside Emma's house. The small, unassuming home looked peaceful from the outside, but to him, it felt like a fortress. He had spent days mustering the courage to come, but now that he was here, he found it hard to move. His heart pounded, his mind replaying every mistake he had ever made. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but the thought of doing nothing felt far worse. He stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door. His hand hovered over the doorbell for what felt like an eternity before he finally pressed it. When Emma opened the door, her expression was a mixture of surprise and wariness. "What are you doing here, Tom?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Tom hesitated, searching for the right words. I want to help. I want to be here for you. For the baby." Emma's skepticism was evident. Her gaze pierced through him, as if weighing his intentions. "Help," she repeated, a trace of bitterness in her tone. "After months of silence? After everything?" Her words stung, but Tom didn't try to defend himself. He knew she had every right to be angry. "I can't change the past," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I want to change now. Please, let me prove it." Emma sighed, her grip tightening on the edge of the door. "You don't just get to walk back into my life and fix everything with words, Tom. If you really want to be here, you'll have to show me. And it's not going to be easy." With that, she closed the door, leaving him standing on the porch. But she hadn't slammed it in his face, and that small mercy felt like a glimmer of hope. Tom returned the next day, not to talk, but to observe. He went to the community market where he had first seen her, buying a few things he thought she might need and leaving them on her doorstep without a note. He noticed the worn swing set in the nearby park and took it upon himself to fix it, remembering how Emma used to enjoy watching the children play there. These were small acts, but to him, they were a way to start rebuilding what he had broken. Emma noticed the little things. She didn't acknowledge them at first, but she saw the repaired swing and the fresh flowers left on her porch. While part of her appreciated the gestures, another part remained skeptical. She couldn't let herself be swayed so easily. She had built walls around her heart for a reason, and Tom would have to do more than fix a few swings to break through them. Margaret, Emma's fiercely protective friend, was less forgiving. She caught Tom one morning as he was leaving another small gift at Emma's door. "You've got nerve showing up here," she said, crossing her arms. Tom braced himself for her anger. "I know I don't deserve another chance," he replied. "But I'm trying to make things right." Margaret studied him for a long moment before responding. "If you hurt her again, you'll regret it. But maybe you deserve the chance to prove yourself." With time, Tom's quiet persistence began to shift something in Emma. She agreed to let him accompany her to a doctor's appointment, though her tone made it clear this was not an invitation to reconciliation. "Don't make me regret this," she warned. Tom nodded, grateful for even the smallest opening. He knew this was a test, one he couldn't afford to fail. At the appointment, Tom was overwhelmed by the sound of the baby's heartbeat during the ultrasound. It was more than a sound, it was a revelation. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of what was at stake. When he looked at Emma, he saw her differently, not just as the woman he had hurt, but as someone who had endured so much without him. The moment wasn't about fixing the past, it was about stepping into the future. Emma watched him closely during the appointment. She noticed the way his expression softened, the tears he didn't bother to hide. It was a side of Tom she had never seen before, and while it didn't erase her doubts, it planted a seed of curiosity. Could he really change? She wasn't ready to trust him, but for the first time, she wondered if she might eventually want to. Tom left the appointment feeling both hopeful and humbled. He knew this was just the beginning, and that Emma's trust would take much more than a single moment to earn. But as he walked back to his car, he realized something important. He wasn't just doing this for Emma or the baby. He was doing it for himself, to become the man he should have been all along. Tom soon realized that proving himself to Emma would be like walking a tightrope, where every step was scrutinized. Each gesture he made was met with either guarded curiosity or outright skepticism. The first major test came when he offered to help her directly. Emma was struggling to carry heavy shopping bags up the stairs to her house. Tom appeared beside her, reaching for the bags. "Let me help," he said gently. Emma hesitated, then replied coldly, "I don't need your help," and brushed past him. The rejection stung, but Tom didn't let it deter him. He understood that trust couldn't be built overnight. Instead, he decided to focus on small, quiet actions. He returned to the community market, buying fruits and other essentials, and left them on Emma's doorstep without a word. He noticed the park bench near her home had a broken leg and fixed it over the weekend. Tom wasn't looking for acknowledgement. He just wanted to contribute in whatever way he could. Emma wasn't blind to his efforts. She noticed the groceries, the repaired bench, and the small changes Tom was making around her space. But her walls remained firmly in place. To her, these gestures felt like drops in an ocean of broken promises. Could such small efforts undo years of neglect? Part of her wanted to believe they could, but another part feared being let down again. She resolved to keep her guard up, even as Tom's actions began to soften her resolve. Margaret, Emma's closest ally and protector, was far less subtle in her distrust of Tom. She intercepted him one day at the park while he was repainting the swing set. "You're really trying hard, aren't you?" she said, arms crossed and tone sharp. Tom stopped mid-stroke, turning to face her. "I have to. For her. For the baby. For myself." Margaret didn't soften immediately, but she began to see the sincerity in his actions. "If you screw this up, Tom, I'll be the first to tell you to leave and never come back," she warned. Gradually, even Margaret started to relent. She noticed how Tom showed up consistently, never demanding anything in return. After a long conversation with Emma, Margaret admitted, "He seems different. I don't trust him yet, but maybe he's earned a chance." Emma, however, wasn't ready to concede so easily. "A chance doesn't mean forgiveness," she replied, her voice steady but conflicted. Tom faced another test when Emma reluctantly allowed him to join her for a prenatal class. She made it clear, "This doesn't mean anything. You're here for the baby, not me." The class was awkward at first. Tom fumbled with exercises and looked completely out of place among the other expectant parents. But as the session progressed, he began to relax, even laughing at his own mistakes. Emma couldn't help but notice his genuine effort. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The pivotal moment came during another doctor's appointment. Margaret had convinced Emma to let Tom attend, arguing that he deserved to witness something so important. When the doctor turned on the monitor and the baby's heartbeat filled the room, Tom froze. The sound was overwhelming, grounding him in a way he'd never felt before. It wasn't just a heartbeat, it was a connection. For Emma, watching Tom's reaction stirred something deep within her. She still had doubts, but she began to wonder if his change might be real. Tom continued to face internal tests as well. The fear of failing Emma and the baby haunted him, but instead of giving in, he used it as fuel to keep going. He began helping with tasks around the neighborhood, fixing fences and volunteering at the local community center. These weren't grand gestures meant to impress Emma. They were quiet acts of service that helped him rediscover his own humanity. Emma, despite her skepticism, started to see a different side of Tom. He was more patient, more humble, and less focused on himself. When she caught him quietly fixing the mailbox at her house one evening, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For Tom, every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. He knew Emma still doubted him, and he accepted that. But he also knew he couldn't stop. Each test, each challenge, was an opportunity to prove not just to her, but to himself, that he could be better. The journey wasn't about perfection, it was about showing up day after day, no matter how hard it got. Emma finally allowed Tom to accompany her to another doctor's appointment, though it was clear this wasn't an invitation to reconciliation. Margaret had nudged her toward this decision, arguing that he at least deserved to witness something significant about the baby. "Don't make me regret this," Emma said as they walked into the clinic. Tom nodded, grateful for even this small opportunity. He knew that this was about more than just showing up, it was about earning her trust, one step at a time. The waiting room was quiet, but the tension between them was palpable. Tom sat beside Emma, stealing glances while she flipped through an outdated magazine. For her, it was just another appointment. For him, it felt monumental. When the nurse called Emma's name, Tom followed her into the exam room, his heart pounding. He had no idea what to expect but knew that whatever happened next would change him. As the ultrasound began, Tom focused on the screen, watching shapes and movements he didn't fully understand. Then came the sound, the baby's heartbeat. It was steady, strong, and utterly life-changing. Tom's breath caught, and before he could stop himself, tears welled in his eyes. That sound was more than just a heartbeat. It was a bridge to a future he couldn't yet see but desperately wanted to be part of. For the first time, Tom truly understood what was at stake. Emma stole a glance at Tom, surprised by his reaction. She hadn't expected this vulnerability, this raw emotion. For a brief moment, she saw the man she had once loved, not the ego-driven architect, but someone capable of feeling deeply. Yet she reminded herself not to get carried away. Actions spoke louder than tears, and Tom still had much to prove. Still, the moment planted a seed of doubt about her resolve to keep him at arm's length. The ride home was silent but not uncomfortable. Tom wanted to speak, to express how much the experience had meant to him, but he didn't want to push Emma further than she was ready to go. Instead, he dropped her off and quietly said, "Thank you for letting me come. It means more than you know." Emma nodded, not looking at him as she closed the car door. But later that evening, as she sat alone, she found herself replaying the moment in the doctor's office. Tom, too, was changed by the experience. The sound of the heartbeat echoed in his mind, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't about redemption or even forgiveness anymore. It was about stepping up for something bigger than himself. That realization gave him a new sense of purpose. He began to see his role not as a way to erase his past mistakes, but as an opportunity to build something meaningful from here on out. In the following days, Tom's actions became even more intentional. He repaired a broken latch on Emma's front door, left meals on her porch, and even fixed the gate of a nearby park where children often played. None of these gestures came with a request for acknowledgement. For him, it wasn't about being seen, it was about doing what needed to be done. These small acts of service became his way of contributing to Emma's life without demanding anything in return. Emma noticed the changes, though she kept her thoughts to herself. She couldn't deny that Tom was making an effort, but the question of whether it was genuine still lingered. Margaret, ever the vigilant friend, commented one evening, "He's trying, Emma. I know it's hard to trust, but maybe he deserves a little credit." Emma didn't respond, but Margaret's words stayed with her. Could Tom really be changing? Or was this just another temporary effort? The answer came one afternoon when Emma was sorting through baby clothes and an entire shelf collapsed, scattering items everywhere. Tom, who had been quietly working on her porch, heard the noise and rushed inside. "Let me help," he said, kneeling beside her to gather the mess. For a moment, Emma wanted to refuse, but the exhaustion in her body outweighed her pride. They worked side by side in silence, and for the first time, Emma allowed herself to accept his help without resistance. Tom didn't make a show of the moment. He didn't use it as an opportunity to plead his case or ask for forgiveness. He simply helped, quietly and diligently, until the job was done. Emma watched him out of the corner of her eye, noticing the care he put into folding each piece of clothing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir something inside her. A tentative hope that perhaps, just perhaps, Tom was genuinely trying. For both of them, the moment marked a turning point. Emma began to allow Tom small glimpses into her life, testing the waters of trust. Tom, for his part, recognized that these tiny victories were more valuable than any grand gesture. He understood now that rebuilding a relationship wasn't about quick fixes, it was about showing up, consistently, no matter how long it took. When Emma finally agreed to have a serious conversation with Tom, he knew it was his biggest test yet. They met at a small cafe in town, a neutral ground where neither would feel cornered. Emma arrived first, her expression guarded, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea. Tom walked in with a mix of anticipation and dread, aware that this wasn't just another interaction, it was the moment that would define whether he had any chance of rebuilding trust. Emma didn't waste time. "If you want to be part of our child's life, Tom, you're going to have to prove it," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Words don't mean anything to me anymore." Tom nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I understand," he replied quietly. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I just need the chance to show you that I can be different." Her conditions were clear and direct: consistency, respect for her boundaries, and, above all, no expectations of rekindling their relationship. "This is about the baby," she emphasized, her gaze never leaving his. "Not about us." Each word was a reminder of the mountain he still had to climb. For Emma, it wasn't about giving him a clean slate, it was about seeing if he was truly capable of change. Tom agreed to her terms, though the weight of them pressed heavily on his shoulders. In the days that followed, Tom threw himself into meeting her expectations. He started small, offering to help with errands and household tasks without being overbearing. Emma, wary of his intentions, remained cautious. One afternoon, she asked him to pick up some items for the baby, a simple task, but for Tom, it felt monumental. He completed it without hesitation, delivering the items to her door with a quiet, "Let me know if there's anything else." Emma began to notice his consistency. He didn't just show up sporadically, he was there every day, offering his support without demanding anything in return. Tom repaired her car, helped organize the nursery, and even stayed up one night assembling a crib after Emma mentioned in passing that she hadn't gotten around to it. These acts weren't grand gestures, they were small, steady steps that began to chip away at her skepticism. Despite his efforts, Emma still wrestled with her own fears. She confided in Margaret one evening, voicing her lingering doubts. What if this is just temporary? What if he reverts back to the person he was? Margaret, who had been cautiously observing Tom's transformation, offered a measured response. "You're right to be careful, Emma. But people can change. And from what I've seen, he's not doing this for show. He's doing it because he wants to." The ultimate test came when Emma asked Tom to accompany her to a prenatal class. It was a seemingly small request, but to Tom, it felt like a lifeline. He joined her without hesitation, awkwardly navigating the exercises and instructions. At first, he felt out of place, fumbling through the tasks. But as the session went on, he began to relax, even laughing at himself when he made mistakes. For Emma, seeing Tom so vulnerable and genuine was a revelation. It didn't erase the past, but it gave her a glimpse of what might be possible. Another defining moment arrived when Emma, overwhelmed by exhaustion, allowed Tom to take over the evening routine. He handled everything, from preparing dinner to cleaning up the house, with quiet determination. Emma watched from the couch, torn between gratitude and disbelief. For so long, she had carried everything on her own. Seeing Tom step up without being asked was both a relief and a challenge to her guarded heart. As Tom continued to show up for Emma and the baby, he began to face his own internal battles. The fear of failure loomed over him, but instead of letting it paralyze him, he used it as motivation. Each day was a test of his resolve, a reminder that change wasn't about grand declarations but about persistence. He wasn't just trying to earn Emma's trust, he was trying to become someone worthy of it. For Emma, the ordeal wasn't just about Tom proving himself, it was about her own struggle to let go of the pain and disappointment he had caused. She wasn't ready to forgive him fully, but she began to see that his actions were sincere. The cracks in her armor were small, but they were there, and they allowed a sliver of hope to shine through. She didn't trust him yet, but she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of change. Tom's persistence was starting to pay off, though the progress was slow and fragile. After weeks of effort, Emma allowed him to be involved in more significant moments, like helping plan for the baby's arrival. It wasn't a declaration of trust, but it was a step forward. For Tom, this small opening felt monumental, a chance to show that his change wasn't superficial. He knew this was a delicate balance, and one misstep could set them back to square one. One of the pivotal moments came when Emma invited Tom to join her in preparing the nursery. "Don't get the wrong idea," she warned as she handed him a list of things to do. "This isn't about us, it's for the baby." Tom nodded, taking her words seriously. He threw himself into the task with a level of care and attention that surprised even him. He painted walls, assembled furniture, and followed Emma's instructions to the letter, asking for her input at every step. Emma, while still cautious, began to see something new in Tom. He was no longer the self-centered man she once knew. The way he deferred to her choices, respected her boundaries, and approached everything with quiet dedication felt different. She wasn't ready to call it trust, but she couldn't deny the shifts happening in her heart. Watching him build the crib without frustration or complaint stirred something she hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of hope. One evening, while sorting through baby clothes together, Emma noticed how carefully Tom handled each tiny piece of fabric. His focus wasn't on impressing her, it was entirely on the baby. "You're taking this seriously," she said, almost as an observation rather than a compliment. Tom glanced up, his expression sincere. "I want to get it right, for them. And for you if you'll let me." Emma didn't respond, but her silence wasn't dismissive. It was thoughtful. Tom's transformation didn't just affect Emma, it began to ripple outward. Margaret, who had been his fiercest critic, started to soften her stance. She noticed how he showed up consistently, not just for Emma but for the community as well. "You know," Margaret said to Emma one afternoon, "he's really trying. I didn't think he had it in him, but maybe you should give him a little credit." Emma didn't respond immediately, but Margaret's words stayed with her. The baby began moving more frequently, and one evening Emma instinctively reached for Tom's hand, placing it on her belly. The gesture surprised them both, but the connection was undeniable. Tom felt the movement, a tiny, miraculous reminder of the life they were bringing into the world. "They're strong," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. Emma didn't reply, but the moment lingered between them, a fragile bridge across the distance that still separated their hearts. As the weeks passed, Tom found himself not only becoming more involved but also more at ease in this new role. He started to enjoy the simple, mundane tasks that once would have seemed beneath him. Whether it was picking up groceries, fixing a leaky faucet, or staying late to clean up after a community event, Tom embraced it all. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was building something meaningful, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Emma began to let Tom into her world little by little. They started sharing moments that felt almost normal, like debating baby names or laughing over an awkward prenatal class experience. These weren't grand, life-altering events, but they were significant in their own quiet way. For Emma, they were reminders that perhaps the man Tom was becoming could coexist with the man she once loved. Despite the progress, Emma remained cautious. Trust, she knew, wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. There were still moments of doubt, times when she questioned his motivations or feared he would revert to his old ways. But as she watched him work tirelessly to make her life easier and the baby's arrival smoother, those doubts began to fade, slowly, imperceptibly, like snow melting under a steady sun. For Tom, the reward wasn't just Emma's gradual acceptance, it was the transformation within himself. He felt more grounded, more connected, and more purposeful than ever before. The life he was building wasn't about accolades or wealth. It was about love, dedication, and showing up every single day. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly give without expecting anything in return. Tom found himself more embedded in Emma's life than he had been in years. Not because she fully trusted him yet, but because she allowed him to help in small, meaningful ways. One morning, while Emma was out running errands, Tom arrived at her house with tools in hand. The front steps were uneven, and the paint on the door was peeling. Quietly, without asking for permission or recognition, he replaced the worn planks and painted the door in a cheerful shade of blue. When Emma returned, she noticed the changes immediately. She didn't comment, but her expression softened. His acts of service became a part of his routine. He wasn't just there for the baby, he was there for her too, even if Emma didn't openly acknowledge it. Tom didn't push for praise or gratitude. He began to understand that rebuilding trust meant doing the work even when no one was watching. He cleaned gutters, planted flowers in her small garden, and ensured that everything in her house was ready for the arrival of their child. Emma started to see these acts as more than just a way for Tom to ease his guilt. There was a consistency in his actions that spoke louder than words ever could. One day, she found herself sitting on the newly painted steps, looking out at the street and wondering if this was the Tom she had always hoped for. It scared her to consider the possibility, but it also gave her a sense of cautious hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was becoming the man she needed him to be. Tom's involvement extended beyond Emma's home. He began volunteering in the community, fixing fences and benches in the local park, and organizing donations for families in need. It was an unfamiliar role for him, but one he found fulfilling. These acts weren't about impressing Emma or anyone else. They were about creating a life that had substance and meaning. For the first time, he felt a connection to something greater than himself. Emma noticed these changes but maintained her distance emotionally. While she appreciated Tom's efforts, she wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. "You're doing all of this now," she said one day, "but what happens when it gets hard? When things aren't convenient anymore?" Tom looked at her, understanding the weight of her question. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," he said honestly. "But I can promise I'll keep trying. Every day." One evening, as Emma rocked gently in the chair Tom had fixed, she found herself thinking about the journey they had both been on. The baby moved inside her, and she placed her hand on her belly, feeling its strength. She thought about how far Tom had come and the ways he had stepped up, not with grand declarations but with quiet, persistent effort. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was enough to make her consider the possibility of a future. Tom, meanwhile, found himself facing his own doubts. There were days when he wondered if his efforts would ever be enough, if Emma would ever fully let him back into her life. But each time those thoughts arose, he reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't just for Emma or the baby, it was for himself. To become someone worthy of the life he wanted to build, even if that life didn't include reconciliation. The turning point came when Emma allowed Tom to stay for dinner. It was a simple meal, but the act of sharing a table felt monumental. They didn't talk about the past or the future, focusing instead on the present moment. It was the first time in years they had laughed together, even if it was over something as small as Tom struggling to open a jar. For Emma, it felt like a glimpse of something familiar and comforting. As the weeks passed, Tom began to see that the road back wasn't a straight line. It was a winding path with setbacks and small victories. But he was learning to appreciate the journey. He found joy in the mundane tasks of preparing for the baby's arrival and satisfaction in knowing he was finally showing up for Emma in ways that mattered. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with himself. Emma still had her reservations, but she could no longer deny the changes she saw in Tom. He was present, patient, and persistent. While she wasn't ready to fully open her heart, she found herself leaning on him more, trusting him with small but significant responsibilities. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start, a fragile, tentative step toward something new. The baby's arrival came early one chilly autumn morning, catching both Tom and Emma by surprise. Emma had gone into labor in the early hours, and by the time she realized the contractions were intensifying, Tom was already knocking on her door, as if by instinct. "I'll drive," he said without hesitation, helping her to the car. For once, Emma didn't argue. Exhaustion and the gravity of the moment dulled her usual defenses. At the hospital, Tom stayed by her side, even when Emma tried to insist she didn't need him there. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, his tone calm but resolute. For hours, he held her hand when she allowed it, stepped back when she needed space, and stayed quiet when she needed silence. He didn't try to control the situation or assert himself. Instead, he let Emma lead, knowing this was her moment. When the baby's cries filled the room, Tom felt his breath catch in his throat. The sight of the tiny, wriggling life they had created was overwhelming. Emma, exhausted and emotional, held their child briefly before looking at Tom. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked, her voice softer than he'd heard in years. Tom nodded, his hands trembling as he cradled the baby for the first time. In that moment, everything else faded away. His past mistakes, his doubts, even his pride. All that mattered was the small, perfect life in his arms. The first few days at the hospital were a blur of sleepless nights and raw emotions. Tom took on every task he could, from changing diapers to fetching water for Emma. He didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because it felt right. Emma, though still guarded, began to notice the depth of his dedication. Watching him care for their son with such tenderness planted the smallest seed of trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One night, Emma allowed herself to lean on Tom, both physically and emotionally. She was too tired to resist his offers to help and too overwhelmed to push him away. Tom stayed by her side as she nursed the baby, quietly supporting her without imposing. For the first time in years, Emma felt she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. It scared her, but it also comforted her in a way she hadn't expected. The vulnerability of those early days forced both of them to confront their deepest fears. For Emma, it was the fear of being let down again, of trusting Tom only to see him revert to his old ways. For Tom, it was the fear of not being enough, of failing Emma and their son despite his best efforts. But instead of letting those fears paralyze them, they found ways to navigate them together, step by tentative step. Tom's transformation became undeniable during one particularly difficult night. Emma, overwhelmed and on the verge of tears, handed the baby to him and said, "I can't do this right now. I need a break." Instead of questioning her or hesitating, Tom took the baby without a word, rocking him gently until he fell asleep. When Emma returned, she found Tom sitting in the dimly lit room, holding their son with a calm, steady presence. It was a moment of quiet strength that spoke louder than any apology ever could. For Emma, allowing Tom to step into this role was a kind of resurrection for herself, too. She began to see that her strength didn't have to come from doing everything alone. It could also come from letting others help, from allowing herself to rely on Tom in ways she hadn't before. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had truly changed. Tom, for his part, felt like a different man. The architect who once prided himself on designing flawless buildings now found joy in the messy, imperfect process of raising a child and rebuilding a relationship. Every sleepless night, every quiet moment with the baby, every small gesture toward Emma felt like a step toward becoming the person he always should have been. Their journey was far from over, but in those fragile, early days of parenthood, something profound began to take root. Emma didn't forgive Tom outright, but she began to let him in. Tom didn't expect instant redemption, but he continued to show up day after day, proving through actions rather than words that he was committed to their new life together. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the baby monitor. Emma sat on the couch, cradling a cup of tea while Tom paced in the nursery, rocking their son to sleep. It was a scene she never imagined, a moment of peace and shared responsibility after years of hurt and distance. Watching Tom through the crack in the door, Emma felt a pang of something unfamiliar, gratitude. It was tentative, fragile, but it was there. For Tom, the weeks after the baby's birth were a revelation. He found himself immersed in the mundane, the routine, and the beautiful chaos of parenthood. Late-night feedings, endless diaper changes, and early morning cries became part of his world, and surprisingly, he welcomed it. The man who once thrived on accolades now found purpose in small, unseen acts of care. Each time he soothed the baby or took over a chore to give Emma a moment of rest, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Emma began to notice these changes, though she was careful not to let her guard down completely. Tom no longer sought validation for his actions. He simply did what needed to be done. One evening, as she watched him carefully fold tiny onesies, she found herself saying, "You've been doing well." Tom looked up, startled by the rare acknowledgement, and replied simply, "I'm just trying to be here for both of you." The changes weren't just confined to their home. Tom's involvement in the community deepened. He continued volunteering, organizing small events, and helping neighbors with repairs. These actions weren't grand gestures. They were consistent efforts to build a life rooted in connection and purpose. For the first time, Tom felt like part of something larger than himself. And while Emma didn't say it out loud, she noticed and appreciated the shift. Their relationship began to evolve in small, meaningful ways. Emma allowed Tom to join her on walks with the baby, and they started sharing quiet conversations about their son's future. They discussed schools, routines, and dreams for the little life they had brought into the world. While these talks were practical, they carried an undertone of hope that they might find a way to coexist as partners, if not yet as a couple. One pivotal moment came when Emma let Tom take the baby for a solo outing to the park. It was a simple act, but for Emma, it was a leap of faith. As she watched them leave, a wave of anxiety washed over her, but she forced herself to let go. When they returned, Tom had a soft smile and the baby was peacefully asleep in his arms. "It went well," he said, placing the baby gently in the crib. For Emma, it wasn't just about trust. It was about believing, even briefly, in the possibility of a new beginning. For Tom, these small victories were everything. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he was determined to build a future that mattered. Each step he took felt like a piece of himself being rebuilt, less polished, perhaps, but more authentic. He realized that the life he had once prioritized, wealth, recognition, and ambition, paled in comparison to the quiet joy of being present for his family. Emma, too, found herself changing. While the scars of their past remained, she began to see Tom not as the man who had failed her, but as someone who was trying, day after day, to be better. It didn't mean she was ready to forgive entirely, but she started to let him into her world more fully. They shared moments that felt almost ordinary, a late-night feeding, a shared laugh over the baby's antics, a quiet evening organizing the nursery. Their journey was still full of uncertainty. Emma knew she might never forget the pain Tom had caused, and Tom knew he might never fully earn back her trust. But they were moving forward, not as a couple defined by their past, but as two people working toward a common goal, creating a stable, loving environment for their son. The return to their new normal wasn't perfect, but it was real. Tom had transformed, not into an idealized version of himself, but into someone who understood the value of showing up, of choosing love and responsibility every day. Emma had softened, not in a way that erased her boundaries, but in a way that allowed her to hope again. Together, they were learning that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something new from its foundation.